Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Friday, January. I wish it were January. Then maybe we could redo much of this year and be in better shape than we are now. June 26, 2026. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John. And if it indeed were January, we would not have seen a report yesterday that next week will hit 102 degrees here. So,
you mean in Washington?
Yes, in the greater Washington
area. You know, we're in New York, so we're going to be 40. It'll be fine. 40 Celsius. So we're joining everybody in Europe. At least we have air conditioning, which seems to be the subject of social media all week, is what's wrong with the Europeans and their fetish against air conditioning. And now we can drop this triviality and turn to our guest today, Editor-in-Chief of Jewish Insider, Fox News political commentator Josh Kraushaar. Hi, Josh. Welcome back.
Hi, John. Great to be back on my 70-degree patio, enjoying the weather in D.C. before it gets 100 degrees.
Please enjoy, because you have not enjoyed this week, except as a producer of news. This has been among the more momentous weeks in the world of Jewish news since October 7th, as the fallout from October 7th now seems to be raining down on all of our heads, not in the way that we were expecting. So we're not going to go into the DSA victories. We've already talked about that. We could talk about all kinds of other stuff, but I think it is important to note that on your website today, you note two important phenomena that represent the boulder rolling down the hill that is the DSA takeover of the Democratic Party and its renewed or new prominence as the sort of harbinger of future Democratic trends. So one is the story about Democratic Party, local party chief in Brooklyn, not like the head of the Democratic Party in Brooklyn, but a district in Brooklyn, named Charrington. And Josh, what did Charrington do that is worthy of note?
Well, this is reflective, John, of just the hatred, extremism, just vile radicalism of the DSA activist class in New York City. So I'm actually reading. Will Bretterman wrote the story today, who's been getting a lot of scoops. He's been covering New York City and on all the crazy politics there before the primaries. But Charrington is just sort of like your kind of politician in the Democratic Socialists of America. And she posted just the most vile anti-Semitic screed last year to her Instagram, praising Adolf Hitler, describing Jewish world conspiracy, saying to a reporter who was asking her questions about the post to get your rabbi, and did not double down on all the anti-Semitism and is a low-level elected official now, won an election in New York City among the other DSA aligned candidates. So this is this is where these candidates come from. This is not, we learned from Chevalier, the likely Congresswoman-elect in Manhattan and other parts of New York City, that this is the pool in which they swim in. And I think people who are in denial that anti-Semitism, hatred of Israel, is not the fuel that is kind of driving these politicians in New York and beyond. I think they're in denial. It's not about affordability. Like this notion that Mamdani's election last year was driven by affordability, which some really political analysts I respect a whole lot, were kind of driving that narrative. But I mean, anyone who's been paying attention to what's been going on in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party for the last couple of years knows how much Israel occupies this and the hatred of Israel and anti-Semitism occupies this really ugly space in their imagination. And it's gotten worse and worse and worse. And we saw the outcome of that electorally in New York City just this past Tuesday.
So Seth, what Charrington did in her post that is the source of this news story is literally run a passage from a pamphlet written in 1923, I believe, called The International Jew by Henry Ford, the creator of the Ford Motor Company, and easily the most prominent open anti-Semite in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, as he was it would be as though Bill Gates, I mean, or Steve Jobs. I mean, he was the leading innovative industrialist of the beginning of the 20th century, and he was consumed with this idea that Jews, Jewish power, Jewish cabals were going to destroy America and the world. And he not only published this pamphlet that had a readership in the millions, he ran a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent outside Detroit that was his daily way of expressing this obsessive message. Here we are, literally 100 years later, repurposing Henry Ford. We're not talking about
dealing with Dearborn itself, by the way, as a locus of a lot.
Well, that's true too. That's right. Dearborn, the home of the largest population of Muslims in a municipality in the United States, as a percentage of the population is in Dearborn, Michigan. So we're not talking about intersectionality here. We're not talking about colonial oppressors. We're not talking about the idea of, Israel not being in the proper community of nations. We are going back in time before there was an Israel, before there was any defined population called the Palestinians, before there was anything to evoke literal, self-consciously and openly anti-Semitic conspiracy thinking and bringing it back and repurposing it in the 21st century.
Right. Well, anti-Zionism was, non-Jewish anti-Zionism. I'm not talking about Jews who were diasporists or whatever before the state of Israel, but like Soviet anti-Zionism was, that's what fed, first of all, that's what supplied Henry Ford with these ideas, was the protocols of the elders of Zion and those types of forgeries and fabrications, but also the things were reversed, right? Which is the Jews' desire to have a state in Israel, to have self-determination in the Holy Land, was looked upon by these people as a branching out of the Jewish conspiracy, right? Today, we think of a lot of anti-Zionism as, oh, they don't like Israel, they don't like what Israel's doing, and so that blows back on American Jews or diaspora Jews or whatever. But the truth is that what this Charrington character is expressing is actually the sort of the original form of it, which sees Israel as an extension of Jewish conspiracy, not Jews as an extension of a militaristic Israeli state. And that is flipping the script for people. And there's a lot of background that I think people are missing in that was in your, what you spoke about.
I mean, the other thing to bring up, Josh, is that Ford was not writing in a vacuum in the early 20s. Views like his had political purchase to the extent that the first major immigration restriction bill was passed in 1924, 2 years after the publication of the International Jew, and it was largely aimed at Jews. The idea being that the previous quarter century had seen this massive influx of immigrants from Southern Europe, I mean, from Italy and also, places like that, but from Eastern Europe. And we needed to close the Golden Door for reasons of whatever. And a lot of the reason that was a populist issue that had purchase and passed through the Congress was views expressed by people like Henry Ford, who popularized them. Here we are a day after a very significant immigration decision in the Supreme Court we might want to talk about later. Again, 100 years after the 1924 immigration restriction bill, we are again talking immigration restriction, except everybody like Charrington and others in the DSA, they're now all for open borders. They're all now for letting as many people in as possible, because the original impetus, which was to prevent some kind of Jewish takeover of the United States, they are now affirmatively looking for a kind of immigrant takeover of the United States through vanguard immigrants who can get themselves elected to Congress and start working their will on the Democratic Party.
Well, and it's on the left and on the right, and I think we should delineate the two, John, because on the left, it started with intersectionality, which is sort of the benign academic kind of crazy kind of theory of the world, that if you're, anyone in power is evil, and there's this, hierarchy of things that are, bad, and we want to take down those who are powerful. And increasingly, we've seen over the last, 5-10 years, the Jews have been sort of the focus of their ire because they have power. And when you look at like one of the things that really breaks off the Democratic Socialists of America from the Democratic Party, it's this sort of broad caricature of the Democratic power base as business people, moneyed interests, and Jews. And that is what you're seeing, the most extreme version of that in these rants and these ugly, just vile anti-Semitism from Charrington. But you see that in Ro Khanna's rhetoric, but from a more quote unquote mainstream progressive who's looking to run for president in the House, talking about the Epstein class, talking about, these very same themes that are trying to really draw attention to. There's a class of people that don't have your interests in hand. And by the way, they're Jewish, right? I mean, that's the whispering, or maybe not so whispering part of what a lot of progressives are increasingly saying. AIPAC, the line that has become a litmus test in a lot of these primaries, which I don't think, frankly, most people who are saying that don't even know what AIPAC is. But that has become this litmus test that also is a standalone for kind of a symbol for Jewish power and influence within politics. So, I mean, at first it was about Israel. I think we all knew that was sort of their way of trying to bring this kind of anti-Semitism and extremism into the party. And now we're seeing the ugly, ugly rhetoric, explicitly anti-Semitic rhetoric from Charrington, but also two of the three Mamdani endorsed and DSA endorsed candidates who won their nominations in New York last night or Tuesday.
I mean, Josh, can you tell us, like, the impression I get from reading Jewish Insider is that these stories are everywhere. If you go looking for them, you will keep finding them. Is that what can you tell us about that from the perspective of a publication that is finding these stories that nobody else is digging up, and the sense that the feeling that we get reading it, that the problem is always actually bigger than it seems, because anytime you go digging, you will find more of the stuff and more of the stuff and more of the stuff, especially at the local level, where the grassroots are sort of training the leaders and the politicians and the activists of tomorrow.
Well, Seth, I think it's important to put some of that into perspective, in that we are seeing it primarily in the Democratic Party in urban area, in big cities, right? We spotlighted what was going on in mayoral races as early as last year, and everyone was talking about Zohran Mamdani, but we also noticed that there was an anti-Israel socialist mayor of Seattle that was about to be elected, and St. Paul, Minnesota, and we saw the trend lines in Washington, D.C., which, now that there really isn't much local coverage in the Washington Post, I don't think a lot of Washingtonians even knew that there was a socialist mayor on the ballot in Washington who got nominated pretty easily this past week in DC. And there are a few other, you have a DS, Spencer Pratt got all the attention on social media. It was actually the DSA councilwoman who actually finished in second place and has a real chance to win the mayoralty in Los Angeles. And I think a lot of the social media conversation obscured what was actually going on in the big cities and college towns. I will say that, like, the big test coming up, and what we're watching closely and we've been reporting on endlessly, is, does this spread beyond the deepest blue parts of the country? My fear is that we saw this in the Republican Party, but once an idea, once you kind of plant that viral seed, if it's only in certain factions and certain parts of the country, it can, because of partisanship, because of polarization, it can easily spread and become party dogma. We're seeing that with progressive lawmakers that I would never have imagined would say kind of borderline anti-Semitic comments are now trying to test those lines out because they see some political advantage in doing so. Mamdani's election, by the way, was the fuel for that. So Maine, Graham Plattner, I mean, the question, can Graham Plattner win in a purplish blue state in Maine? Is that possible given the fact that he had a neo-Nazi tattoo, that he praised Hamas terrorist videos, that he obviously is an abusive boyfriend? Those are the things that would have, any one of those things would have sunk a candidacy for any office a decade ago, 5 years ago. I don't think we're as confident that's going to happen again. So that'll be a big test. And also Michigan. We have primaries coming up in August, most notably for the Senate race in Michigan, where you have a contest between someone who's unabashedly anti-Israel, flirts at the very least with these anti-Semitic slogans, and is all on the socialist, line, essentially, against the more mainstream Democrat endorsed by Chuck Schumer and the party leaders. That looks like Abdul al-Sayed, who's the former candidate, has got the momentum and may be able to win actually a Senate seat in a general election, given
Chris
his
Van Hollen endorsed him yesterday. Is that right?
Yeah, and Van Hollen and other, I wouldn't be surprised if you have other progressives that kind of follow suit, that are seeing the political opportunities by playing to that Mamdani-like base and think that there isn't as much of a political disadvantage, right? Where we're so polarized, we're so tribal writ large, that I think they're realizing, some of these left-wing politicians, progressives, that you would never imagine being part of this crowd, are increasingly testing these lines and testing these positions that would have been beyond the pale not that long ago.
It strikes me that AIPAC, what do you call it? What do you call something like AIPAC? The 5 initials. What do you?
Abbreviation.
No.
Acronym.
Thank you. Okay. So AIPAC, most people couldn't even tell you what the 5 letters stand for if they know what AIPAC is. So because they say AIPAC because they don't want to say Jewish lobby or Israel lobby, though that was the term that was the term of art, was just to say the Israel lobby wants this and the Israel lobby wants that. That maybe sounded too harsh and too conspiratorial. Now they can just say AIPAC. But here's what is of interest to me, using the term AIPAC as a kind of catch-all. It's the dog whistle, it's the wink that you are with the progressive cause to say you won't take money from AIPAC and you don't like AIPAC. So the clear predecessor to this in the world of lobbying, making a lobby an issue, is the NRA, right? The National Rifle Association. So the NRA, for people, liberals and on the left, was the villain from the 1980s through 1994, really, and Democratic Party organized organized a lot of its domestic agenda around opposing the NRA, its refusal to agree that gun control was important, that it was looking to arm people and cause more violence and all of that. And here's the difference between AIPAC and the NRA. The NRA was genuinely populist powerful, had millions upon millions upon millions of members. And in 1994, they were a key element of flipping American politics by helping the Republicans win 52 seats in the House and taking the House for the first time in 4 decades and bringing liberal Clintonism to a screeching halt and reviving DLC Clintonism in the rest of Clinton's term. AIPAC and the Jew we do not have that. There is no army behind the Jews to protect the Jews against the use of being Jewish as a weapon against them, which the NRA had. And in fact, the Democratic Party backed off its, the centrality of gun control. It pops up every time, I mean, it pops up. It popped up after that, school shootings, various other things. Even Donald Trump had this moment where he started thinking that he needed to do something or say something about gun control after the Sandy Hook massacre and bump stocks and things like that. But mostly, guns are no longer a major political issue in the United States, also partially because of the Supreme Court assenting to the idea that the Second Amendment does, in fact, protect private gun ownership. Jews are afforded no such populist protection. We're tiny people. We make up 2% of the population. And even in the city with the largest Jewish population, not only in America, but in fact the world, if you're talking about the municipality of New York City alone, and Tel Aviv might be larger if you take in all the surrounding suburbs. But New York is the largest population of Jews in the world, and an explicit anti-Semite became mayor, and 2 anti-Semites have now won these insurgent races to take congressional seats away from Democrats, largely fueled by that. So this is part of the new world that we are going to have to reckon with, and to move on to say a state that is blue. I don't even think it's really purple, though there are areas of it that have Republican voters. Colorado, which did actually have two Republican senators 15 years ago, but no longer, 14 years ago. There is a candidate for Congress also primarying a sitting Democratic Congresswoman. And she is a young, very attractive child of Ethiopian refugees who got into the United States through a lottery system and got a law degree, and was apparently, or says she was fired by her law firm for spending her time organizing anti-Israel protests in the wake of October 7th. Can you tell us something about her, Josh?
Yeah, this is Malat Kiros. I think I'm pronouncing her name right,
Yeah.
but she's a DSA affiliated challenger to Congresswoman Diana DeGette in the Denver. It's the district that encompasses the city of Denver. I knew Diana DeGette and her team when she first got elected to Congress. She probably, when she was first elected in the late 1990s, would have been considered one of the most progressive Democrats on Capitol Hill. Now she is scrambling to fend off this challenge from Malat Kiros because she's, and it's mainly on the issue of Israel, not seen as progressive enough. Increasingly, as we've talked about, to be progressive, to be a leftist in good standing, you have to hate Israel. And DeGette's one sin is that she generally has been not 100%, but like 80% supportive of Israel in her voting record, and that is toxic for city Democratic primary voters. Kiros is one of these candidates too, John, that it's not just about Israel. It's as we all know, I think this is not any surprise to listeners to this podcast, but when you have such ridiculous rhetoric about Israel, anti-Semitism isn't far away. So she was actually just asked on one of the big news channels, the local Denver newscasts this week, whether she considered the murder and the firebombing of the Boulder march to raise recognition for the Israeli hostages at the time, whether she considered the murder and the firebombing attack against that march anti-Semitic. She refused to say it was anti-Semitic. So that is this is. I think a lot of people who have covered you read the New York Times, you read mainstream publications, and they're afraid to acknowledge the obvious, which is that this worldview is not the DSA worldview, not just about Israel. They dislike Jews, and they're willing to excuse terrorism against Jews in America, right? that is Moa Kiros. She was just interviewed, and that's her on the record just a couple days ago. And these candidates, I don't think they were afraid to speak their mind not that long ago, but now they're emboldened. The Mamdani's election in New York, and now these New York elections for these three deep blue congressional seats this week in New York. It's emboldened this cadre of candidates to say the most hateful, anti-Semitic and extremist stuff, and we're seeing that with Kiros. And the election is Tuesday, so we'll know whether this stuff can sell in Denver like it sold in New York.
Even more interestingly, it seems to me, it's that their anti-Semitism is now a feature and not a bug. That is to say, it is part of what rallies people to their side. It is part of how they are raising money, grassroots money, on the internet. There is and always has been and always will be a large world of people who are consumed with hatred of Jews and want to advance explicitly anti-Jewish causes and ideas. And this dovetailing with progressivism as it does and I would say a certain type of anti-American pro-Arab nationalism, these have all combined into this unholy stew that once would have been pretty easy to oppose on any one of the three planks. No, socialism is bad. So the fact that you're a democratic socialist, that's bad because people don't like socialism. B, your Jew hatred is extremely unattractive, and we like Jews fine. And C, you're siding with Arab terrorists who blew up the World Trade Center, blew up the Khobar Towers building in Saudi Arabia, and have killed thousands of Americans since the early 1980s at a very minimum. Any one of these three things could have been disqualifying. Now you put them all together and you have a Lego structure that's like a voting booth that may get them elected. The election also, you have Tuesday, we have the election in Colorado, and I believe Tuesday we have the election in Michigan. And yeah.
Well, I would add I mean, it is shocking that you see candidates like Chevalier, you see candidates like Kiros that face no pushback. I think and I know you guys talked about Hamawi's nomination in New Jersey, and which, by the way, is a pretty Jewish district in central New Jersey. Seth, I'm sure not well aware of the politics in that one, but I was struck not just that Hamawi, who was a guy who was affiliated with an Al-Qaeda affiliated group in the 1990s when he worked in Bosnia and was the associate of the Blind Sheikh, who was the inspiration for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. But the fact that not only that guy win the nomination, but the fact that in a crowded Democratic field, very few of the Democratic candidates running against him even wanted to bring that obvious opposition, intel up in the race. They did not want to be seen as being Islamophobic in the rhetoric of the Democratic Party base. And that is, to me, a very big warning sign that when your own opponent won't go after you with obvious, attacks that will move the needle in a race because they're afraid of being seen as racist or Islamophobic. That is the water in which a lot of the Democrats are swimming in now. And it's what you look at the races where more moderate pro-Israel candidates won. Richie Torres won easily in the Bronx. You can look at Steny Hoyer's race where he handpicked a pro-Israel moderate successor. It's that the Democrats were actually willing to fight back and fight for their values. That Richie Torres, didn't back down. That he spent a lot of money. That he prepared for his race and defined the terms early on. Same thing in Maryland. But you see this with Schumer in the Senate, like this weakness that they don't want to speak out. They don't want to even confront the extremism and the anti-Semitism that's taking place within their very party. And you do see some voices that are trying to go after it, stop the cancer from metastasizing, but more often you're seeing a fear, which I think is the most dangerous and most shocking element of this all. That there's a fear among moderate and even Jewish Democrats that to speak out against this is going to create bigger problems, and that's I think a big red flag too from the recent election results.
Yeah, that maybe there was a video the other night of revelers at one of the victory parties taunting there were Hakeem Jeffries was giving his speech on they were watching Hakeem Jeffries, the House floor leader, give his speech on TV, and they were chanting "You're next" or something like that, right? That there is this. We had this discussion a couple years ago also, which was, will AOC primary or recruit someone to primary Hakeem Jeffries, who was the leader after the squad managed to push out the last leader, right? I mean, he took over for Pelosi. He's Pelosi's chosen successor and was seen as a candidate that was palatable to the base. Hakeem Jeffries was picked because he was not going to be what AOC and the others considered Elliot Engel and maybe even Adriano Espaillat and those guys to be, which is tools of an old establishment, which, whose time has come and gone. And yet Hakeem Jeffries is not out of trouble, right? I mean, there is a hunger for not just to have this crew in Congress, but I see a hunger for the leadership itself, like this why wait
Right.
sort of attitude.
But here's what's interesting about your observations here, which is that Hakeem Jeffries should be immune, just as Adriano Espaillat should have been immune, according to the logic of the Democratic Party's ideology, which is that we're a gorgeous mosaic and identity politics is the most important way to sort American politics. Adriano Espaillat was the head of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Leftists should not be primarying such a person. It could be that Republicans could, beat such a person maybe in an open race in a more complicated district. But you wouldn't expect Democrats to be primarying the head of the Hispanic caucus. Similarly, Hakeem Jeffries will be in November, if all goes the way we think it's going to go, the first African-American Speaker of the House. That should be sacrosanct. The idea that Hakeem Jeffries should be in the crosshairs of the Democratic Socialists of America shows you that democratic socialism, two aspects of it, one of which is the radicalism of its view of America, American capitalism, and everything else, cannot fit into even the left-wing party in the United States. It has to overtake it and overcome it. And I mean, Hakeem Jeffries is not exactly, he's not Mike Johnson. He is a very liberal politician. And black, and that should be fine. But so socialism trumps identity politics, and it appears anti-Israel sentiment that leaches into anti-Semitism trumps them all. Because if Hakeem Jeffries were an activist against Israel in his position as minority leader, if he had been introducing bills in 2024 and 2025 for cutting off aid to Israel or supporting an arms embargo for Israel or something like that, he probably would be inoculated. They wouldn't be cheering "You're next" for him. I mean, the thought that you would cheer "You're next" when what he is going to be next is the first African-American Speaker of the House of Representatives, that's a journey I couldn't possibly have imagined the Democratic Party would take over in the last decade. And here we are.
When you look at not just the power dynamics, but also the dynamics of who's supporting these socialist candidates. And there's been some really good precinct by precinct analysis by smart people who have underscored that it's the wealthiest young, the upscale, the least economically oppressed people in these districts that are the ones that are at the rallies, that are screaming for Jeffries to go, that are driving the fuel for these candidates, and it's the working class Black and Hispanic voters that are, and especially in Espaillat's district, it was the working class Hispanic vote that really strongly went for him, but it wasn't enough given the demographic changes and frankly the socioeconomic changes in that district. But that's the trend. These are white progressives that, I mean, and it's that alliance of the white progressive left with like the Islamist extremism that is a very, demographically, if you just looked at representation, there's only 3% radical, there's it's not the radical Muslim ideology that is that big. It's more that the white progressive leadership of the DSA has sort of jumped on these issues and formed an alliance, and they've provided the fuel for these candidates and for these constituencies.
Well, so in Espaillat's district, for example, a good liberal voter, liberal left voter in that district would once have been satisfied and sufficient, thinking proudly that he was a white guy voting for a guy with a very, very thick accent who himself came in to the United States as an illegal alien, which was trumpeted in his advertising locally here in New York, the first undocumented immigrant to be elected to the Congress. That was actually in his campaign material until 2026. A white liberal living in Washington Heights or Hamilton Heights, that would have been a emotionally satisfying vote, perfectly emotionally satisfying vote for them. Not only that, but he had risen to the top of the greasy pole. He was head of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And now it's like, nah, that's old news. That's not sexy. That's not transgressive enough. Here we're being given an option to go even further, and we're going to jump on it. Now, he only lost by less than 0.5%. So that's an interesting aspect of this, is that it's not like Chevalier won going away. He was 49.9 to 49.5 or something like that in the election results, and he might live to fight another day. You never know whether that that magic will be reasserted in 2028 if he's still energetic enough to run. But I just think it's very telling that the voting to satisfy your cultural priors has shifted the way that it's shifted, in that these are symbolic votes. Well-to-do, white, educated New Yorker is not voting on affordability. That's a load of crap. You just mentioned it was a load of crap. That they're not voting on affordability. They're voting to satisfy their symbolic understanding of what they are supposed to be here in the United States and what the United States' representatives should be saying in our national political conversation.
Absolutely. And I will add one thing, which is sort of the elephant in the room, no pun intended, but the role of Trump, and I think particularly the ICE's role in deportations and the Minnesota violence and that episode, you could see in real time as we were covering it at Jewish Insider. If you remember, like in 2025, Democrats were racing to run to the middle. Rahm Emanuel got into the teasing a presidential campaign. Josh Shapiro was the flavor of the moment. There was a real momentum in the Democratic Party to find someone who was not Kamala Harris, who could actually appeal to working class swing voters, and that was where the energy in the party was. Seth Moulton came out against and then backtracked against trans athlete. There was this whole energy until April of 2025, and that was when Trump just unleashed ICE, and that had a disproportionate impact in a lot of these urban and Hispanic communities, including Espaillat's district. So I will say that something got set off in the Democratic zeitgeist at that moment, where that was when we started seeing the rise of Mamdani. That was when you started seeing these far left candidates getting purchased out of nowhere. That was when you started seeing the willingness of even Democratic Party pragmatists to say, Trump is so evil that, we're not going to condemn anything from our own side. So I do think that there's some of that. And I think that may be why you're seeing it in particular in some of these urban majority minority districts where there is that especially ICE and immigration that's hanging over. You're right that Espaillat I think he is an undocumented immigrant, and that's a big part of his story, but he also comes across as not as much of a fighter in the broadest of senses. Right. I think that's what a lot of these voters in the Democratic primaries are looking for right now.
I think that's a very important point, because it wasn't just ICE by the spring of 2025, right? It was DOJ. It was Trump's full-throated support for Israel against Hamas and to conclude the war in Gaza on terms favorable to Israel. He was a kind of wrecking ball of all of these assumptions that were being made by the Democratic left, going at the campus anti-Semites, the people who were like Daria Eliza Chevalier, who organized QAD at Columbia. It wasn't just part of it, but was the organizer of it. And it was like the perfect storm. Just as for some of us, there was a kind of almost, oh my God, I can't believe this is all happening. Like, they're closing cabinet departments, they're supporting Israel, they're engaging in Title VI action against anti-Semitism at universities. Like, this is a dream come true. But for them, it was the ultimate nightmare. And then the fact that there was a kind of armed element to it in the form of ICE going into cities, occupying Washington, D.C., being sort of like on every street corner in downtown Washington, D.C., these ICE agents masking when they fought people or were, deployed in Minneapolis. It was, a kind of assertion of what was like the Handmaid's Tale for the left come to life, and the left has a lot of life in it, and there are reasons why people don't really understand this, why the left has so much life to it, but it's the same reason that so many conventional Republican politicians were knocked off and knocked over in the 2010s, which is, you got no juice. I'm not getting anything out of you. You're just getting along to go along, which is what American politics has usually been like and been about. It's how you get to the top of the greasy pole. You offend as few people as possible. You make as many friends as possible, and you kind of slip your way up. You slide your way through and then climb up, right? And now this is like, that's compromising. You have no principles. You stand for nothing. You believe in nothing, and at least these people will fight. They will fight. The thing is now, the DSA...
in 2014, the big moment was Dave Bratt primarying Eric Cantor, right? Because Eric Cantor was number 2.
The whip, yeah, he was the whip. He was the number 2.
He was the House whip, and Dave Bratt was a professor. And I mean, not to be dismissive of some, but he wasn't a political animal, is what I'm saying. He was somebody who came from the outside, and I remember the shock at watching those primary returns come in, because it was still unusual at that point to have somebody in leadership get knocked off by somebody whose name you just learned when the polls closed. That was like the shot across the back, and it just kept happening. And now in both parties.
Right. But Trump as a figure, if you are a Democrat and you do believe that Trump is the most evil person on earth, and you have to ask yourself the question, why is he, and how did he do this, and how did he do it twice, and how did he do it after the insurrection, and how did he do it after all of the trials and everything like that? You got to say he knows something we don't know, which is playing it within the boundaries. Being within the boundaries is a loser's game. And you've got to go outside and wrench your way in, to make change and to get rid of the bad guys. And, you can't use a nice institutional reestablishment of guardrails and saying that, what Trump does is what we need to do is get back to the glory days of Clinton or something like that. It's like, no, he's changed everything. Now the Republican Party is definitively evil. They must be destroyed. They are Israel's catamites. We must take down Israel. We must take down American capitalism, which is not working for us. And so, that is Trump's effect. Politicians have enormous effect even on the other party when they succeed. George W. Bush's message in 2000 of compassionate conservatism was a response to Clintonism. It was a way of trying to reach out to the center while remaining, fluent with the past, because Clinton had redefined the center, and the center required you to say that you cared and you did blah, 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 whatever. That was not the Republican message before that. That was not where the party was before that. And so, you have to look to the opposition sometimes to find out where the new power is going to be. It's just that the Jew hatred is unbelievably unnerving. Like, I understand why socialism might suddenly have a renewed appeal in the United States. There is a lot of income inequality. We are seeing enormous numbers of corporate executives and people like that making sums of money that no human being has ever made before. And, young people are not sure what's going to happen with their careers. The market doesn't seem to be helping them that much. All of that, you can see where the attractiveness of a term like socialism for people who did not live through any socialist era in their life and know what evils socialism created for people all around the world, in theory, saying, basically the power should shift toward the poor and away from the wealthy, and that, for example, here in New York, that the city should set rent prices, which just happened last night. The city council agreed to a rent freeze for all rent for 2 million rent stabilized apartments, an enormous intrusion on the private marketplace that Mamdani did promise, and that supposedly is a way of enforcing his affordability agenda. Although, of course, as is always the case with price controls, it's only going to make things more expensive and not less as time goes on. But, so welcome to everybody who is foolish enough to believe in price controls. That's where we are. We are in a revolutionary. We have an outside the box president, and so we're going to have an outside the box rival party.
Well, I'm reminded of the David Axelrod line, which is, I'm paraphrasing, is that basically people pick presidents that are the opposite of those before them, and they go in the exact opposite direction after someone's been around for long enough. And we saw that with Trump, kind of as a backlash against the progressivism of Barack Obama. We are seeing that now with and by the way, I think the Democratic view of being opposite to Trump was just simply being anti-Trump, to the point where Kamala Harris basically had, Liz Cheney and Elizabeth Warren the same week campaigning for her in the final weeks of the 2024 campaign. And that was sort of the reason operandi for the Democratic Party for much of the first Trump term and into 2024, that you build a big, broad coalition that's anti-Trump, that says democracy dies in darkness, that we're for institutions. Like there was something that was like a throwback to frankly now different times. And I think, if you're just looking at this through a political lens, there is something entrepreneurial in what these very radical folks are doing, which is that no, we can't just have that was really there was no substance to the anti-Trumpness of the last decade. We actually want to put some meat on the bones, and they're putting a very socialist, populist, and frankly like anti-Semitic meat on those bones, which I find awfully disturbing. But they're in some ways they're trying to take a page from Trump's initial 2016 playbook, which is, as you said, John, we don't want to abide by any rules. We're going to play the same games that Trump did. It worked out for him. Why shouldn't we try it ourselves? And that's the dangerous, if both parties kind of succumb to their most radical and extreme voices, we're in a pretty big world of hurt as a country.
Well, look, in 2017,
and also is it a sense of, it seems to me a source of protection for the candidates themselves, right? The Colorado candidate Murat, I'm sorry if I'm forgetting her name.
Quiros.
But the one Quiros. This is nobody knows who she is before yesterday. I feel like, nobody being the universal nobody, in the general world, and yet she's going. The Squad and the DSA factions are going to feel extraordinarily protective toward Quiros if she gets into Congress, right? I mean, they're going to they now will identify her as someone who must be protected at all costs. That's the other side of this anti-Israel, anti-Semitism stuff with the candidates, that it is a way to find your protectors in the prison yard of Congress in a weird way. And have a big brother or a big sister always be watching your back. And because they will say to you, well, they're accusing Adam Hamawi of being, a terrorist just because he volunteered for an Al-Qaeda cutout. It's like the guy who testified on behalf of the blind sheik testified on behalf of the blind sheik. You can't make that not be what happened, but because they did that, it's going to offer them a level of protection that they didn't used to have because of the rally round the flag effect of the DSA and Squad and all these factions.
We saw that in 2019, right? We saw that when the All About the Benjamins moment came along, and Ilhan Omar said that, people supported Israel because it was all about the Benjamins. And the intent of the leadership of the House, of the Democrats in the House, was to censure her, was to punish her for saying what she said. And when they got together as a caucus, the caucus told Nancy Pelosi they would not agree to punishing Ilhan Omar. And they therefore issued a statement decrying anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. That was a moment in time at which the Democratic Party institutionally could have provided consequences for explicit anti-Semitic action. And when push came to shove, it did what you're talking about, which is it had her back. It was not going to hand the Republicans any issue here. And it had turned out anyway, 2 years earlier, of course, an enormous effort was made to tag the Republican Party as the anti-Semitic hate party because of the Charlottesville confrontation, right, with the Proud Boys or whoever it was marching, saying Jews will not replace us, and then that poor woman getting killed by being rammed into by a car. And this idea was, okay, well, it's now clear, the world of people in 2015 who went crazy with the anti-Semitic rhetoric on Trump's behalf, against me, against Seth's wife, Bethany Mandel, against Ben Shapiro and all of that, these social media swarms that hit us. And then Trump gets elected. Trump gets elected saying he wants to make a real estate deal between Israel and the Palestinians, which is an unnerving phrase for some of us. And then comes Charlottesville. And then you know what happened? Trump, it turned out, wasn't so bad, right? He recognized he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He recognized Jewish sovereignty over Jerusalem. He recognized Jewish sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and he started the process of the Abraham Accord. So by then, the idea that you would have this easy target where anti-Semitism was just part of the brief you made against Trump. He was not only anti-women and anti-this and anti-that and a crook and a monster, but he was also hated Jews, and therefore Jew hatred could be opposing that could be part of the Democratic brief. And Trump took that away from them and therefore also provided an opening for these explicit anti-Semites in the party who themselves, now I'm going to just go back another 6 years and then drop it. The moment that changed the Democratic Party forever came at the convention in Philadelphia in 2012, when the platform was being read aloud and things were being agreed to by voice vote. And when it came up that the passage that was in every Democratic platform, that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel, came up, there was a vote. A vote was called against it, and the delegates on the convention floor voted against Jerusalem being being referred to as the capital of Israel. At which point, the chair, using the powers of the chair, called instead for a voice vote. The voice vote was overwhelmingly no, and Antonio Villaraigosa, the then mayor of LA, said, "The ayes have it. Jerusalem remains the capital of Israel." Clearly the intent
After briefly looking off stage, if you were watching it on TV, you saw him cast a glance like, what do I do here?
Right. So the point here is that the grassroots, or whatever you might want to call it, the organizing heart of the Democratic Party, made clear its feeling about Israel as early as 2012.
Well, and I'm thinking 2016 too, being at the Democratic Convention, and that was when the Democratic Convention coincided with the dumping of the Hillary Clinton emails. And that was when Debbie Wasserman Schultz was ousted, and Hillary Clinton was booed at her own convention. And I think people now remember that as sort of this patriotic kind of convention with a lot of the moderate and military leaders speaking on Hillary Clinton's behalf. But if you remember the beginning of that convention, it was also those very radical elements that were just responding in furor and taking on their own party's nominee at the very beginning of that, and it shared a lot of that same grassroots nihilism that we're seeing now. Look, I think that moment in 2018 too, John, we all talk about, a lot of people talk about Nancy Pelosi was this really strong leader who never would have tolerated such kind of, craziness within her own caucus. Well, no, like, she backed down, and she was just as vulnerable to the same forces that Hakeem Jeffries is facing. And she was very weak. If you call that, if you care about anti-Semitism, that was a moment of weakness for Nancy Pelosi. And it was a sort of a proof that whole facade, that whole narrative is really a lot of it's that born out of self-interest and
Right.
not in reality. But yeah, I mean, I think you can look at, like, you take the picture back to 2012 and you can see these moments where, the forces of darkness kind of creep in slowly but surely.
So my point here is that, right, that this is a long provenance. Like, it's not just, oh my God, Trump was reelected, and then the Democratic Socialists popped up in 2026, and Mamdani pops up in November of 2025. They are standing on the shoulders of a lot of people who came before them, and there have been penumbras and emanations and moments over the course of certainly the last 15 years, and I would say the last 25 years, that show that this was where the Democratic Party was headed. And now this tree, it takes a long time for a tree to grow to maturity, and this is not a fully mature tree, but 25 years is a long time for a tree to go from being like, a twig to to something that is bearing fruit. It's now bearing fruit, and it was cultivated, it was kept alive, it was nourished, it was fed. And now it is, is the vanguard.
Right. And that's the scary thing about when you hear people like Tom Suozzi, was correct, in New York, former congressman who came back to, retake his seat in New York because they needed a moderate, non-crazy Democrat, saying like the DSA is organizing and the moderates like us out here, we're out here complaining or worrying or whatever. But Tom Suozzi is not, and this is not a criticism of Suozzi at all, but Tom Suozzi, a recently retired before he came back and then unretired, a Brett Favre sort of figure, is not in a position to build any part of the Democratic Party's machinery, the apparatus, right? I mean, in other words, the guys who are saying, we get it, they're organizing, they're building, we're not, are not in a position to actually build a competing structure within the party. So what happens? You have the Jewish Insider's reporting on Steny Hoyer was very good because it explained the day of the primary. There was this great article that explained how Steny Hoyer called in favors and arranged for his chosen successor to be picked to win the primary way ahead of time. He is a pro-Israel figure, boafo, and he but that's it. That was Steny Hoyer's swan song, right? Steny Hoyer's out, and now his chosen successor is not a power broker, but somebody who got in because Steny Hoyer cashed in all those chits and favors and whatever, and he's now now boafo is just sort of starting from scratch. And so what happens? How do the Democrats who want to organize, who understand and say publicly, we get it, we have to build something, we have to work, how do they do it? Who among them is in a position to do something like that?
Can I just want to quickly answer that, which is that by definition, they're not builders. These are institutionalists. That means that they exist inside and accept and believe in the structure that they have lived in forever. If you tell them your house is burned down, the house is burned down, you now need to build a new house. And they don't know how to build a new house. No one taught them carpentry. They were living in an existing house. They're not carpenters, they're tenants. And so the house is no longer there. It blew away in a hurricane or something like that. And then over here are the people who have been building little houses all over the place. They know how to do it, and they're not going to teach you how. You were the other type. They are the makers. You are the resident. And so you're either going to have to move into their house or you're going to be homeless.
And adding to that, I would say that when you do see the Democrats getting their act together, it's when things hit rock bottom. Like it's never darkest before the dawn. And San Francisco's an interesting example of that, where they elected a socialist, anti-incarceration DA. Crime went up, homelessness went up, like the city was unlivable. The mayor was on the left, that they actually elected a Bloomberg kind of acolyte, Daniel Lurie, a more moderate candidate, not that long ago, because things in San Francisco got so bad that even the most progressive Democrats realized we can't keep going on like this. I think in these legislative primaries where these are just, the Congress has become sort of a glorified talking society and arguing society and social media, show off for social media society. It's the consequences seem a little less significant. Obviously, we see what's going on, but I don't think a lot of voters are looking at this as having a direct impact on their daily lives, which is why we don't see as much governor's races turning on these socialist themes and extreme themes. They tend to be more pragmatic. It's these congressional primaries where we see the most of the action. But look, I think in a weird way, like in New York City, going back full circle, if Jessica Tisch wasn't NYPD commissioner and Mamdani actually, really let his, full freak flag fly, things would get bad in New York City and people would get upset. And then they would realize there would be a consequence to all of this radicalism and there would be a backlash. We saw that during 2020 and 2021. The problem is this is I will say that, and I looking at Mamdani, he clearly understands that he's trying to kind of see how far he can go, but by keeping Tisch on board as commissioner and Menon as a check at the city council level, like the worst, it could have been worse. It could even be worse if those folks were not in place. So I think it sadly, like, for people to actually realize the consequences of their decisions, things do have to actually, people have to just let governance just collapse according to the ideology that these people campaign on, and that would create the backlash. But we haven't seen that because there are enough people in institutions that are keeping things afloat in a lot of these places. And where that hasn't happened, where crime, for example, was going out of control in many cities post 2020, you did see a moderate backlash within the Democratic Party, except people have forgotten about that. It now feels like ancient history.
Could it come from anger at Mamdani from within New York Democrats? Is it possible that, there are people like Nydia Velázquez who chose her own successor in Congress, but then ended up taking on Mamdani because Mamdani was, sort of the new. Whatever it is, Mamdani crossed certain people who were on their way out the door, I guess is one way of saying it. Aspayat is an interesting example of that also. And there's a couple of stragglers left, like Tish James, the Attorney General, who is like, Mamdani is out over his skis. He's too big for his britches.
They're pipsqueaks.
Is there any...
They are pipsqueaks.
Yeah.
Tish James didn't get Trump. She was supposed to get Trump. Nydia Velázquez can barely speak English. They are pipsqueaks. He won 900,000 votes. They are pipsqueaks. Nydia Velázquez probably hasn't gotten more than 75,000 votes in her district ever, even though she's won it for 30 years or however long she's been there is no institutional democratic force to counter Mamdani without the kind of collapse that Josh is talking about. And the question about him is whether, given this unprecedented early political success in having coattails and this success he's had in getting the rent freeze, is he going to start feeling his oats and saying, I don't need Jessica Tisch anymore. I don't like her. I don't want her. I don't need her as building her independent power base to run against me in 2029. I'm gonna ditch her for somebody who is more favorably inclined toward my views of things. Watch that space. That could really, really happen. Josh Kraushaar, thank you so much for joining us and having such a, you're like actually reporting on things. So you're like, you have substantive things to talk about, whereas we're just like shooting it over here every morning. So thank you.
But I'm in the middle of everything. It's like PTSD having to kind of report on all the crazy.
Sorry about that, but we are very much in your debt for the brilliance of the job that you're doing at Jewish Insider, and you and your colleagues, Mr. Brederman and others who are Gabby Deutsch and everybody who is like just knocking it out of the park every day. So we'll be back
and have just released an app. Is that right? Maybe we should. Yes,
thank you. Yeah, no, we have a brand new app, which is very, if I can say so myself, very elegant. You can easily read all the stories, share them, easy to log in. I really couldn't commend it enough. So I was on vacation last week, and I was actually using it to kind of catch up on all the news that was going on. So it is downloaded on the Apple Store or Google Store, or wherever you get your apps. But it is a really, really good product. That's an expansion.
I'm excited. Jewish Insider app. Okay, Josh Kraushaar again, thanks. And for Seth and our absent colleagues, we'll be back on Monday. I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.